Strike action, also called labor strike, on strike, grieve, or simply strike, is a work stoppage caused by the mass refusal of employees to work. A strike usually takes place in response to employee grievances. Strikes became common during the Industrial Revolution, when mass labor became important in factories and mines. In most countries, strike actions were quickly made illegal, as factory owners had far more power than workers. Most Western countries partially legalized striking in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. Strikes are sometimes used to pressure governments to change policies. Occasionally, strikes destabilize the rule of a particular political party or ruler. In such cases, strikes are often part of a broader social movement taking the form of a campaign of civil resistance. Notable examples are the 1980 Gdansk shipyard or 1981 warning strike, led by Lech Walesa. These strikes were significant in a long campaign of civil resistance for political change in Poland, and were an important mobilizing effort that contributed to the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of Communist Party rule in Eastern Europe. History. Etymology. The use of the English word strike first appeared in 1768, when sailors, in support of demonstrations in London, struck, or removed the top-gallant sails of merchant ships at port, thus crippling the ships. Official publications have typically used the more neutral words work stoppage or industrial dispute. Pre-industrial strikes. The first historically certain account of strike action was towards the end of the 20th dynasty, under Pharaoh Ramses III in ancient Egypt on the 14th of November 1152 BC. The artisans of the royal necropolis at Deir el-Medina walked off their jobs because they had not been paid. The Egyptian authorities raised the wages. An early predecessor of the general strike may have been the secessio plebis in ancient Rome. In the Outline of History, H.G. Wells characterized this event as the general strike of the plebeians. The plebeians seem to have invented the strike, which now makes its first appearance in history. Their first strike occurred because they saw with indignation the friends, who had often served the state bravely in the legions, thrown into chains and reduced to slavery at the demand of patrician creditors. During and after the Industrial Revolution, the strike action only became a feature of the political landscape with the onset of the Industrial Revolution. For the first time in history, large numbers of people were members of the industrial working class. They lived in cities and exchanged their labor for payment. By the 1830s, when the Chartist movement was at its peak, a true and widespread workers' consciousness was awakening. In 1842, the demands for fairer wages and conditions across many different industries finally exploded into the first modern general strike. After the second Chartist petition was presented to Parliament in April 1842 and rejected, the strike began in the coal mines of Staffordshire, England, and soon spread through Britain, affecting factories, mills in Lancashire and coal mines from Dundee to South Wales and Cornwall. Instead of being a spontaneous uprising of the mutinous masses, the strike was politically motivated and was driven by an agenda to win concessions. Probably as much as half of the then industrial workforce were on strike at its peak, over 500,000 men. The local leadership marshaled a growing working-class tradition to politically organize their followers to mount an articulate challenge to the capitalist political establishment. Friedrich Engels, an observer in London at the time, wrote, "By its numbers, this class had become the most powerful in England. The English proletarian is only just becoming aware of his power, and the fruits of this awareness were the disturbances of last summer." As the 19th century progressed, strikes became a fixture of industrial relations across the industrialized world, as workers organized themselves to collectively bargain for better wages and standards with their employees. Karl Marx has condemned the theory of proud own criminalizing strike action in his work The Poverty of Philosophy. In 1937 there were 4,740 strikes in the United States. This was the greatest strike wave in American labor history. The number of major strikes and lockouts in the U.S. fell by 97% from 381 in 1970 to 187 in 1980 to only 11 in 2010. Companies countered the threat of a strike by threatening to close or move a plant. International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights adopted in 1967 ensure the right to strike, and Article 8 and European Social Charter adopted in 1961 also ensure the right to strike in Article 6. Variations. Most strikes are undertaken by labor unions during collective bargaining as a last resort. The object of collective bargaining is for the employer and the union to come to an agreement over wages, benefits, and working conditions. A collective bargaining agreement may include a clause which prohibits the union from striking during the term of the agreement, known as a no-strike clause. No-strike clauses became prevalent in the United States immediately following World War II. Nowadays, virtually all modern collective bargaining agreements contain prohibitions on work stoppages. Some in the labor movement consider no-strike clauses to be an unnecessary detriment to unions in the collective bargaining process. Generally, strikes are rare. According to the News Media Guild, 98% of union contracts in the United States are settled each year without a strike. Occasionally, workers decide to strike without the sanction of a labor union, either because the union refuses to endorse such a tactic, or because the workers concerned are not unionized. Such strikes are often described as unofficial. Strikes without formal union authorization are also known as wildcat strikes. In many countries, wildcat strikes do not enjoy the same legal protections as recognized union strikes, and may result in penalties for the union members who participate or their union. The same often applies in the case of strikes conducted without an official ballot of the union membership, as is required in some countries such as the United Kingdom. A strike may consist of workers refusing to attend work or picketing outside the workplace to prevent or dissuade people from working in the place, or conducting business with their employer. Less frequently, workers may occupy the workplace, but refuse either to do their jobs or to leave. This is known as a sit-down strike. A similar tactic is the work-in, where employees occupy the workplace but still continue work, often without pay, which attempts to show they are still useful, or that worker self-management can be successful. This occurred, for instance, with factory occupations in the Biennio Rossi strikes, the 2 Red Years, of Italy from 1919–1920. Another unconventional tactic is work to rule, in which workers perform their tasks exactly as they are required to, but no better. For example, workers might follow all safety regulations in such a way that it impedes their productivity, or they might refuse to work overtime. Such strikes may in some cases be a form of partial strike, or slowdown. During the development boom of the 1970s in Australia, the Green Ban was developed by certain unions described by some as more socially conscious. This is a form of strike action taken by a trade union or other organized labor group for environmentalist or conservationist purposes. This developed from the Black Ban, strike action taken against a particular job or employer in order to protect the economic interests of the strikers. United States labor law also draws a distinction, in the case of private sector employers covered by the National Labor Relations Act, between economic and unfair labor practice strikes. An employer may not fire, but may permanently replace workers who engage in a strike over economic issues. On the other hand, employers who commit unfair labor practices may not replace employees who strike over ULPs, and must fire any strikebreakers they have hired as replacements in order to reinstate the striking workers. Strikes may be specific to a particular workplace, employer, or unit within a workplace, or they may encompass an entire industry, or every worker within a city or country. Strikes that involve all workers, or a number of large and important groups of workers, in a particular community or region are known as general strikes. Under some circumstances, strikes may take place in order to put pressure on the state or other authorities, or may be a response to unsafe conditions in the workplace. A sympathy strike is, in a way, a small-scale version of a general strike in which one group of workers refuses to cross a picket line established by another as a means of supporting the striking workers. Sympathy strikes, once the norm in the construction industry in the United States, have been made much more difficult to conduct due to decisions of the National Labor Relations Board permitting employers to establish separate or reserved gates for particular trades, making it an unlawful secondary boycott for a union to establish a picket line at any gate other than the one reserved for the employer it is picketing. Sympathy strikes may be undertaken by a union as an organization or by individual union members choosing not to cross a picket line. A jurisdictional strike in the United States labor law refers to a concerted refusal to work undertaken by a union to assert its members' right to particular job assignments and to protest the assignment of disputed work to members of another union or to unorganized workers. A student strike has the students not attending schools. In some cases, the strike is intended to draw media attention to the institution so that the grievances that are causing the students to strike can be aired before the public. This usually damages the institution's public image. In other cases, especially in government-supported institutions, the student strike can cause a budgetary imbalance and have actual economic repercussions for the institution. A hunger strike is a deliberate refusal to eat. Hunger strikes are often used in prisons as a form of political protest. Like student strikes, a hunger strike aims to worsen the public image of the target. Sick out, or blue flu, is a type of strike action in which the strikers call in sick. This is used in cases where laws prohibit certain employees from declaring a strike. Police, firefighters, air traffic controllers, and teachers in some U.S. states are among the groups commonly barred from striking, usually by state and federal laws meant to ensure the safety or security of the general public. Newspaper writers may withhold their names from their stories as a way to protest actions of their employer. Legal prohibitions. Canada. On 30 January 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that there is a constitutional right to strike. In this 5-2 majority decision, Justice Rosalie Abella ruled that, along with their right to associate, speak through a bargaining representative of their choice, and bargain collectively with their employer through that representative, the right of the employees to strike is vital to protecting the meaningful process of collective bargaining. Paragraph 24. This decision adopted the dissent by Chief Justice Brian Dixon in a 1987 Supreme Court ruling on a reference case brought by the province of Alberta. The exact scope of this right to strike remains unclear and will no doubt be subject to further litigation. Prior to this Supreme Court decision, the federal or provincial governments would introduce back-to-work legislation, a special law that blocks the strike action from happening or continuing on further. Canadian governments would also impose binding arbitration or a new contract on the disputing parties. Back-to-work legislation was first used in 1950 during a railway strike, and as of 2012 has been used 33 times by the federal government for those parts of the economy that are regulated federally, and in more cases provincially. In addition, certain parts of the economy can be proclaimed essential services, in which case all strikes are illegal. Examples include, the Government of Canada passed back-to-work legislation during the 2011 Canada Post lockout and the 2012 CP rail strike, thus effectively ending the strikes. People's Republic of China and the former Soviet Union. In some Marxist-Leninist states, such as the former USSR or the People's Republic of China, striking was illegal and viewed as counter-revolutionary. Since the government in such systems claims to represent the working class, it has been argued that unions and strikes were not necessary. In 1976, China signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which guaranteed the right to unions and striking. But Chinese officials declared that they had no interest in allowing these liberties. Trade unions in the Soviet Union served in part as a means to educate workers about the country's economic system. Vladimir Lenin referred to trade unions as schools of communism. They were essentially state propaganda and control organs to regulate the workforce, also providing them with social activities. In France, the right to strike is recognized and guaranteed by the Constitution. Minimum service during strikes in public transport was a promise of Nicolas Sarkozy during his campaign for the French presidential election. A law on social dialogue and continuity of public service in regular terrestrial transports of passengers was adopted on 12 August 2007, and it took effect on 1 January 2008. This law, amongst other measures, forces certain categories of public transport workers to declare to their employer 48 hours in advance if they intend to go on strike. Should they go on strike without having declared their intention to do so beforehand, they leave themselves open to sanctions. The unions did and still do oppose this law and argue these 48 hours are used not only to pressure the workers but also to keep files on the more militant workers, who will more easily be undermined in their careers by the employers. Most importantly, they argue this law prevents the more hesitant workers from making the decision to join the strike the day before, once they've been convinced to do so by their colleagues and more particularly the union militants, who maximize their efforts in building the strike in the last few days preceding the strike. This law makes it also more difficult for the strike to spread rapidly to other workers, as they are required to wait at least 48 hours before joining the strike. This law also makes it easier for the employers to organize the production as it may use its human resources more effectively, knowing beforehand who is going to be at work and not, thus undermining, albeit not that much, the effects of the strike. However, this law has not had much effect as strikes in public transport still occur in France and at times the workers refuse to comply by the rules of this law. The public transport industry, public or privately owned, remains very militant in France and keen on taking strike action when their interests are threatened by the employers or the government. The public transport workers in France, in particular the cheminots, are often seen as the most radical vanguard of the French working class. This law has not, in the eyes of many, changed this fact. United Kingdom. The Industrial Relations Act 1971 was repealed through the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974, sections of which were repealed by the Employment Act 1982. The Code of Practice on Industrial Action Ballots and Notices, and Sections 22 and 25 of the Employment Relations Act 2004, which concern industrial action notices, commenced on 1 October 2005. Lawyers have suggested that the courts are taking an increasingly relaxed approach when interpreting the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act 1974, meaning that it is becoming easier to strike. Legislation was enacted in the aftermath of the 1919 police strikes, forbidding British police from both taking industrial action. In discussing the possibility with colleagues, the Police Federation, which was created at the time to deal with employment grievances and provide representation to police officers, has increasingly put pressure on the government, and repeatedly threatened strike action. Prison officers have gained and lost the right to strike over the years. Most recently, despite it being illegal, they walked out on 10 May 2012. United States. The Railway Labor Act bans strikes by United States airline and railroad employees except in narrowly defined circumstances. The National Labor Relations Act generally permits strikes. but provides a mechanism to enjoin strikes in industries in which a strike would create a national emergency. The federal government most recently invoked these statutory provisions to obtain an injunction requiring the International Longshore and Warehouse Union return to work in 2002 after having been locked out by the employer group, the Pacific Maritime Association. Some jurisdictions prohibit all strikes by public employees, under laws such as the Taylor Law in New York. Other jurisdictions impose strike bans only on certain categories of workers, particularly those regarded as critical to society. Police and firefighters are among the groups commonly barred from striking in these jurisdictions. Some states, such as New Jersey, Michigan, Iowa or Florida, do not allow teachers in public schools to strike. Workers have sometimes circumvented these restrictions by falsely claiming inability to work due to illness. This is sometimes called a sick-out, or blue flu, the latter receiving its name from the uniforms worn by police officers, who are traditionally prohibited from striking. The term red flu has sometimes been used to describe this action when undertaken by firefighters. Often, specific regulations on strike actions exist for employees in prisons. The Code of Federal Regulations declares, encouraging others to refuse to work, or to participate in a work stoppage by prisoners to be a high-severity level prohibited act, and authorizes solitary confinement for periods of up to a year for each violation. The California Code of Regulations states that participation in a strike or work stoppage, refusal to perform work or participate in a program as ordered or assigned, and recurring failure to meet work or program expectations within the inmate's abilities when lesser disciplinary methods fail to correct the misconduct by prisoners is serious misconduct, under 3,315, leading to gang affiliation under CCR 3000. Postal workers involved in 1978 WorldCat strikes in Jersey City, Kearney, New Jersey, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., were fired under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, and President Ronald Reagan fired air traffic controllers and the PATCO union after the air traffic controllers strike of 1981.